My dad's here, and we're a pretty awesome community, so I'm glad you guys are keeping this going. And I work for Copley Fine Art Auctions. For anybody that doesn't know, I'm a decoy specialist there. Been there for 15 years now. And we've got an auction coming up, so I brought a few birds from that relate to what's going on tonight, as well as some of the x-rays that we're going to look at. You guys all know what decoys look like, and that half a bird there is about the last you're going to see of the outside of a bird for the next 100 or so slides. So I'll try to keep it moving along. We've got a lot to look at, and afterwards, if you have any questions, I'm happy to address them. So without further ado, looking into decoys, a tutorial on the X-ray and decoys. Now, this is a presentation I put together about 5 years ago, and things have changed since then, almost entirely for the better. When we first started doing this, it was still sort of a fringe thing that we started doing on a wholesale level at Copley, and I've been really encouraged to see how the entire decoy community is using decoys as part of the toolkit. So this is a kind of an encore of an old presentation and still relates as much as ever. All right. That is a Mason black duck inside and out to get us oriented. And we're going to look at the Decoy Research Toolkit. There's a lot of ways to evaluate decoys. Number one, I love to look at provenance first. Let's start with what we know. What is the history of the object? That's using literature, exhibitions, transaction history, private sales, auction catalogs. I've been going through auction catalogs back to the 1960s in the very first auctions, and they're still tremendously relevant. I'm turning up new information or reinterpreting things. That's great. White light and daylight. Obviously we all want to have the lights on when we look at our decoys and evaluate them. Ultraviolet and black light, also UV. That's an incredibly superficial way of looking at a surface. It's necessary but not sufficient. Magnification. You can bring out a cheap loupe and literally see 10 times more of an object pretty simply. Why wouldn't you do that? X-rays, also known as radiographs, are what we're going to talk about tonight. Comparables, that's just comparing, what do we know about a Mason that we've already handled and how does that relate to this piece? We'll compare and contrast. And then experience and exposure, the more you handle, the more you learn. Tonight, we're going to focus on X-rays, and we've shot, I was roughing it out, it looks like probably about 2,000 decoy X-rays at this point. And you never stop learning, that's for sure. So we've looked at a lot of them, and we'll all look at a lot of them tonight. I like to give credit to Mr. James McCleary. He did a lot of things right with decoys going back to the 1960s. In 1986, the decoy market went through a massive change. The record price for a decoy broke and then was broken again, and then it was smashed, and then it was shattered, and then it got topped. The market just went over the top in '86. And I think that was probably part of the reason that McCleary was having this conversation recorded in '88. I think there will come a time when expensive birds up for auction may have an X-ray film available at the time of the sale. Dr. James M. McCleary, MD. When I first ran that quote, I was sort of more of a call to arms, and McCleary said it, don't listen to me, listen to him. And I think we're a lot closer to that reality, or in a lot of ways we've reached that reality. To cover what I'd like to address tonight, we'll first look at what is the X-ray, kind of a history of the technology. Then we'll look at the materials that we're looking at in X-rays. We've got, obviously, wooden decoys with painted surfaces, so a lot of that. And then inside we're going to find other hard materials, a lot of nails and screws. Body construction, you can tell if a bird's hollow or solid. That can be interesting and tell you more about an artist's or craftsman's mentality when they were making the bird, how they felt about the project, and maybe a hollow commission they weren't excited about. Restorations and repairs, that gets a lot of attention, but it's certainly not the only value that X-rays offer. Other applications, and then lastly, how do you get an X-ray? and then we'll follow that up with anything I might not address. Why do we care so much? I don't think I have to tell you all why we appreciate decoys. I pulled this quote from Dr. Everett James. He's probably not somebody that a lot of people remember now, but he was a pioneer in applying X-rays to decoys. So I wanted to give him credit. So backing up to the timeline, 1898, the X-ray is invented. The guy put his hand in front of an X-ray broadcast, and there was a fluorescent tube on the other side, and he saw the inside of his hand. So I'm going to call that an immediate application to art, or sorry, to health. And then somewhere I found that it was applied to art within a year. So it didn't take people long. What is the X-ray? It's part of the electromagnetic spectrum. We probably haven't looked at this in science class in high school. It's just past visible light and ultraviolet light. And the quality of the wavelength is such that it takes an object that we see as opaque and it sees it as translucent. So it's a electromagnetic wave passing through the object, and then they catch the image on the other side. Getting back to decoys, 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act dramatically changes decoys and their purposes, and the year after, Joel Barber records that he has officially begun collecting decoys. There's Barber and the Bird Treaty Act. Through the 70s, we get, the decoy market starts to take off. People are paying real money for them. And it was also in the 70s that Dr. Everett James gets into using X-rays on decoys. So it happened as soon as there was money involved, there was also people using this technology. And it was a lot harder to get back then, to be fair. There's the old Mackey catalogs where a description for a $100,000 decoy might be one sentence with no estimate. And there's an old Dr. Everett James X-ray. He liked Carolina birds. In the 1980s, you've got James is publishing articles on decoy X-rays. Is Your Decoy X-Rated is a fun title, and that's when that great McCleary quote came through in the 80s. So it's sort of a slow build. You'll see books starting to publish X-rays in them. All right, on to what to look for in an X-ray. Different types of materials, obviously. What kind of wood is being used? What's the quality of that wood? And what's the history of that wood? There's a lot of surprises underneath original paint. Different types of paint. That's going to help us with dating. It'll also tell us about repaint and wear. Nails, screws, and other hardware. Hollow and solid body. We can usually answer that without an X-ray, but still fun to see. Lead shot. We see a lot of lead shot. I know I'm talking into this microphone. Can you guys still hear me when I'm looking away? Okay. Construction techniques, a lot of fun with construction techniques, especially for anybody that's made a decoy. You get to kind of reverse engineer some of these things and see craftsmanship techniques that you'd never see otherwise. Gives you a lot more respect for the makers. Clues on dating, a lot of that's going to go back to the hardware types and types of paint you see. You can also compare the inside of a decoy to the inside of a comparable decoy and learn more about, was this the father or the son carving? And you'll see the same kind of signature moves inside of a decoy that you'd see outside. So it's good with applying different attributions to birds. Obviously, repaint is a big consideration that goes along with repairs. It's tremendously helpful for that. And then surprises. There's always stuff that you've never seen before when you just keep shooting these things. Seems like a couple of these slides are out of order. This is Dr. Everett James making a case for X-rays. Astute collectors have come to rely upon radiographic studies as part of their standard evaluation practice prior to acquisition of a valuable decoy, 1998. And I think that's more relevant or more true today than it has ever been before. So he was a little bit ahead of his time there. And as you can see, he knew what he was talking about from a technical standpoint, as he had one of the most impressive titles you could have from an academic perspective. Good for him. And 21st century, this has been really big for us. Huge improvement in the technology, the same way that we all have a camera in our phone now. Digital imaging technology has really opened up the availability of X-rays. We don't shoot them on film anymore. We shoot them digitally, and it has all the obvious advantages that you have with your iPhone. 2017, that was when the first Decoy catalog was fully X-rayed. It was a Donald C. O'Brien Jr. collection. It was something that we looked at it and we said, well, we're going to have to X-ray just about everything here, so let's go ahead and do the whole thing. I think we've done about 7 or 8 catalogs where literally every bird in the catalog has had an X-ray. It's fun to do that. We followed it up in 2018, and today it's really become much more of a standard part. So good job, everyone, on that. Evaluating decoys. Obviously, we like the look of decoys. Aesthetics, we like real decoys, authenticity, provenance, age, authorship, comparables, condition, rarity. So how is an X-ray going to help us? It's going to help us with authenticity, age, authorship, who made it, comparables, and condition. So it's a pretty useful tool that applies to birds in a lot of different ways. Some of the things that we're going to look at, I feel like I covered a lot of this, but I think I've addressed these, so I'll keep on cruising here. We'll start off with materials and X-ray absorption. So what are we looking at in real life, and what does that look like or what does it look like feel like in the hand, look like in white light, and then what is it going to look like in an image? In this presentation, there's a lot of ways of presenting an X-ray. Mine are all going to be black in the background, and white is going to represent the object. So white is going to be your dense materials. That means the X-ray is being absorbed. Black is where the ray is passing through, so there's no absorption. Some of the things that are going to show up white are going to be white lead paint, solid metals like nails and screws, eyes, kind of the obvious hard things. You'll get gray is going to be the relative thickness of the material, obviously. Shades of gray. A lot of wood is going to usually be in that gray zone. Mixed paints. So if you've got a gray paint with white lead paint and carbon-based black, that's going to usually show up a little bit more gray. And then like a black paint on a thin piece of wood. X-ray can blast right through that. It won't show up as anything. It'll be pure black. In this bird, you've got a little hollow cavity, so you can see it's thinner there, and then light wood and grain. One of the challenges is we are not used to looking through objects. You can hold up a glass in front of you, but we don't have a lot of things that we see through that we're used to just seeing one side of. So there is a dimensional challenge in looking at them. So you have to remember that you're seeing 2 sides of the same thing, so you'll have, doubling up of the same features. Sometimes you need multiple angles. So you got a 3-dimensional object flattened to 2D, and you lose that perspective. Here's a way of wrapping your head around it. We'll only do this once. Here's a shorebird. It's got lead paint on it, and it's got little bits of shot in it. And we shot it a few times, so you can follow it around, and now you know that it was shot on one side, and that's how far the lead worked its way in. You can even see the little entry holes next to the lead shot. It's a good indicator it probably wasn't repainted. Here the bird comes around again, and that's what it looks like when you shoot all the way around them, and we only did that once. Wood and paint, most common things we're going to see. For a basic waterfowl decoy, here's a mason solid body. It's got a peg going through the head, so we're picking up on a little shade of gray there. It's got lead paint, so it's showing up pretty darn white because it's got a heavy, Mason had that heavy white lead paint. And this is a Mason Challenge grade. It's got a few nails in the bottom there. And looking at wood, here's a great Ward 36 canvas back. And you're going to see all sorts of different presentations of wood, even the same piece of wood shot from different angles. If you think of wood as a book with all the leaves of the book stacked up, it's going to change depending on how you approach that book. Are you seeing 1 page, or are you seeing 500 pages? In this case, we are seeing the grain of the wood going through the bird here, and we don't see any of that grain in the head. And does that mean that the head is a totally different kind of wood, or does it mean we're just seeing it from a different angle? So when we come above that bird, we look at the grain, and we've essentially turned that book 90 degrees, and you can see the grain working through nicely. So sometimes you'll see grain, sometimes you won't, depending on, usually your cedars and your pines are going to have grain from some angle. It's neither good nor bad to see it. It can be there and totally invisible. We'll also see irregularities in the wood, like knots. This one has got that knot right there. Then when we get on top of the wood, here's some white lead paint. So obviously you've got that nice little cheek patch up by the bill. That's going to be a lead-based paint, and you can see it clear as day there in the x-ray. So that's a place where you look at that bill and say, oh man, the color really changes on that bill. Is it replaced? No, there's no paint in that bill to pick up the x-ray. It's as good as can be. Looking at some more lead paint. Here's a bird. It's a Kroll merganser. It's got lead all over the body. You can even make out some of the feathering on the wing patch there. And then at the neck seam, you'd say, oh man, is this reheaded? And if you look really close, you can see just above the neck seam that continuation where the lead just made it past the seam. But at first glance, you might be concerned it's reheaded. Bird's perfectly fine. All original. Then sometimes you'll get an interaction of grain and paint. Here's a Raleigh Horner bird, and with the way he finished his bird and painted it, the paint was picking up more on that soft grain all over the bird, and so you get this interesting sort of exterior grain pattern into the paint. You can also see the nicely painted speculums, the way he trimmed them out with a little liner. There it is there in the bottom corner. Then not all birds are made of cedar and pine. We've also got balsa. I've got a Ward balsa teal up here that's not so different from that, with peach basket wings. Balsa a lot of times is going to be a composite block of wood. Balsa doesn't have very pronounced grain, so it's not going to look like your other woods. In this one, we have a body seam right here. But that's not the maker's body seam. That's probably just the way the block of balsa came. That's totally normal in balsa. You've also got little peach basket wings you probably can't see in this projection. And then you got a cedar or pine head up there. Also, again, variations in the lead paint. That teal's got a nice little white under the chin. Probably not going to x-ray a lot of cork decoys, but this is what it would look like. Cork's going to have that pile up of lead paint inside the texture of the surface, so that's perfectly normal. And then you got a wooden head up there, so you can see the comparison. Canvas on wood. This is a great Lothrop Holmes bird. That canvas really soaks up the paint, so you're getting a super white bird there. And then you can see all these tacks down around that bottom board edge. And this is a place where you can appreciate the craftsmanship a little bit more when you see something like that. This guy went to town having fun stretching that canvas and not skimping on his tacks. Paper mache. I didn't shoot this, but I found it from the Shelburne Museum. So technically, I think we've covered every material you can make a decoy out of. Nails, screws, and tacks. These are particularly important. The first nails that you'll see are cut nails. Cut nails, they're still around today, but they were around long before wire nails. So you usually associate those with early birds, but you can still go to the hardware store and buy them, so it doesn't guarantee it's early. You'll get some variations on fine cut nails, or on cut nails, including fine cut nails. Sometimes they'll have this little L head at the top. I've only seen those in a handful of birds, and they've almost exclusively been exceedingly fine birds that were made by just phenomenal craftsmen. So sometimes you'll have a correlation between materials and craftsmanship. That's a place where we've seen that. We'll talk about that more later. Around 1880, the wire nail comes into being, and it was one of those industrial advances that absolutely changed the way that people connected pieces of wood. They were far cheaper. They could make them by tremendous fractions cheaper and faster and at larger quantities. And so they kind of took over pretty quickly around 1880. So it's a great dating tool. If you have a wire nail, you know that that nail did not go in much before 1880. So that's a great dating tool. We've applied that a lot of times. Sometimes you'll get little wire nails or brads. And they don't have the pronounced heads, but you're still going to see that point at the bottom that helps to define a wire nail. You'll get tacks, which are just kind of a funny variation of nails. And if you can make it out, we've got kind of the classic wood screw. This type of wood screw with a pointed tip shows up around 1850. Before that, there were flat tips, and we've only seen that a few times. There's not a lot of birds that predate that are still around today. So we'll back up and just focus on applying a couple of the things that we've already looked at to a bird and seeing what it can tell us and putting that in an entirely positive light. So we're gonna date a preening pintail that's got a tremendous story, but we're gonna skip the story for now and just focus on the X-ray. I literally took this X-ray, sent it to a buddy of mine who studies old houses, so he's pulling nails to date old houses all the time. And I gave him the context of, this bird was probably from the Philadelphia area. I didn't tell him anything else, what can you tell me about it? And he looked at the nails and said, those are early, mature cut nails, so probably 1835 to 1860. And then the screw was particularly interesting. It's a flat-tipped screw, and you can still take a screw and cut the tip off, but in the context of this bird with those old nails, it means there's a possibility that that screw was from around 1840 or so. They didn't have the technology to taper the tips in the beginning of mechanical screw making. So we've only seen this a couple of times, but here it was in this wonderful bird. So just looking at the X-ray, we can say this bird's probably made between 1845 and 1860. Then if we look at the underside of the bird, we pick up a brand, C.W. Morris. That ties in with a rig of Casper Wistar Davids. Let's see, Davids was 1825 to 1863, and Morris was 1806 to 1877. So these guys are pretty darn early. They're some of the earliest guys that we know involved with decoys. So if we put those two things together, and one of those fellows died in the wheat field of the Battle of Gettysburg. So to put a little context around it. So if we look at the provenance based on that brand and the materials, we can kind of cross-reference. Yeah, this bird's probably been made around 1850, and that is significant from my standpoint. And these birds have a phenomenal story beyond that, from how they made it from the Philadelphia area down to the Delmarva Peninsula, actually. It's the best continuous line of provenance we've ever been able to put together, I believe. But we can take them from today all the way back to, I think all the way back to those fellas. Then looking at materials a little deeper, what happens to iron when you put it in water, especially salt water? It rusts. This is an Albert Lang decoy. He's, again, one of the early makers. This bird has got quite a history of nails. It would have been nailed together back when he made it in the 1800s, and then re-secured when those nails rusted out. So you've got a huge history of nails. So we're starting to see some shot in this bird. But that rust can be really telling when we're trying to trace back the physical history of a bird. In an instance like this, that trace of rust is, I like to call them ghost holes. And here's a Dudley decoy. And you can see you've got a ghost hole down here at the base of the neck but not up above it. And then I think there's another ghost hole. You can't see it so well in here. You can see this other hole here. So you know that neck and that body have an interesting history. Does it mean they're not original to each other? Not necessarily. This bird's got a longer story than that. There's actually breaks in the neck where it's split open. Somebody had cleaned those out, put them back together. So these were actually original to each other, but it looks at a casual view, and if you're just looking at the x-ray, you'd say, oh, that's absolutely reheaded. This one turned out to be an original head, but you needed to look at it from multiple angles with an x-ray, and you needed to look at it in person, study the paint, and you could connect the dots. And that's, again, where the x-ray is one tool in the toolkit, because it could suggest that it's reheaded, and in fact it's not. It's just had some work done on the head and neck. Shot, and on Long Island, lots of shot. So here's a couple birds. We got a Verity that's just absolutely lit up. I figured there's probably close to 200 pieces in there, I think. And then there's a Charlie Clark that got lit up pretty well as well. And again, having an appreciation for the history of these things, when you see that much shot in a decoy, you don't need the x-ray to say, oh, this bird's all shot up. But it does remind you of the circumstances in which those hunters were operating, and what their style of hunting was. And the Long Islanders, you see this over and over again, where they'll just be peppered like no other region. So just to do a quick review of some of the things we've looked at this bird, we got a whole Mason merganser. It's a wooden decoy. It's got lead paint. One thing that you'll see with lead paint is you get this kind of halo, and that's because on the back of a bird you've got a pretty thick or pretty long piece of lead paint that you have to look through. And it's always nice to see that lead halo going around the outside of a bird. Because based on your x-ray settings, the guy can shoot it in a way to make a bird with no lead paint look like it is absorbing a lot. But it's really just the exposure to the x-ray. What you can't do without lead paint is create that halo effect. So that's always something that's good to see when you're trying to tell what kind of paint you've got on a bird. This bird's got wire nails, so that gives us an idea of when it was made. Mason makes sense, after 1880. Again, we got that dowel in the neck, which we'd expect to see in a Mason. It's got some lead shot. We can see the little holes where it's going in. That means those holes probably weren't filled with overpaint. And it's a hollow body, which is what you would expect in a, I think it's a premier grade bird. That's what I would expect in a premier grade bird. Looking at some other general examples, with another lead paint bird from another view, we can see those nails going in. Another angle of that dowel in the neck, hollow body cavity. And if you notice, there's a really distinct pattern to this body cavity, and it's all these circles stacked on top of each other. And that's because it was not hand scooped with a chisel, it was drilled out with a Forstner bit. And that makes sense for Mason decoys. You'd expect a factory to have that. Well, not all the early makers had access to it. The other way of hollowing out a bird is with chisels. It takes a lot more work. It's more of a Zen-like process where you've just got to get into it and enjoy working with the wood. And when you do that, it's fun to make it nice on the inside, and I've seen people do it. I've done it myself, and when we look back, these guys were enjoying hollowing out these birds over 100 years ago. And if you look at the inside of this, it's nice, clean, sweeping lines throughout the whole thing. This looks like a guy who might have been carrying this bird himself out in the marsh, because he did a great job of hollowing it. He wasn't just technically creating a hollow cavity to please a patron and say, oh yeah, it's a hollow bird. And some makers did that. So it gives you a little more appreciation for the craftsmanship. With hollow bodies come seams. People handled their seams in all different ways. You'll see a lot of white lead caulk in the seams. So here is that ellipse shape there of that white lead caulk. When you get on top of it, you can see there's quite a bit in there. That's something, if you only saw one x-ray, you might say, what's going on here? It's perfectly normal, and you'll see all sorts of variations on that. Sometimes you won't have anything at all. And then in this case, it's an early bird we were looking at before, and it has cut nails, which we would expect. Then sometimes you'll see some funny things. This is a John Wells canvasback, and when he was making it, when you're putting the bottom board on, the bird's upside down, and you put that caulk on, and it runs in. So when you see these running drips on a bird up like this, you kind of wonder about it, and then you put it in context of, when were those runs happening? Naturally, you're going to have some funny upside down looks because birds are made upside down for a time. This bird, let's see. When you get inside of birds, you'll also see how they attach the heads. A lot of the Ontario guys did hollow bodies. Unfortunately, a lot of them just put one fastener in, and so you'll get a little wiggle in those heads. And in this case, he's got a screw. He is putting a washer on there, which is a nice touch. I think this one stayed tight. And one of the great things about having the screw on the inside of the hollow body is one less entry point for water to get into the decoy. So another just kind of good construction idea. You don't have nail holes up here that are going to rust out, chip the neck. Then more things about hollow bodies. To create a decoy with a hollow body, you have to have 2 blocks of wood, and you probably don't want to hollow the bird until you have roughed out the surface or finished the surface. So it means you're going to have these 2 blocks of wood, and you're probably not going to want to run it through a bandsaw or cut it once it's rounded. So you have these 2 blocks, get them together, and you got to hold them together. The way they did that on the Delaware River pretty routinely is they'd have 1 or 2 screws right in the middle, and you get this nice little trace of a screw hole. So you might look at that and say, oh, what was going on there? Is there a problem here? Nope, that's how they made these birds when they were hollowing them out. And this one is pretty cool. You can see he actually left that little indent there. So what that tells me is he probably hollowed the bird out, put that screw back in just to get a bite on it, keep it lined up. Then he sealed it up with the caulk and the nails. Then he pulls the screw out, bungs the screw. That's a guy who knows what he's doing. Also, he doesn't want his head to spin around, so he's got the screw in there. Plus, he's putting a few brads in so that head doesn't spin around like a lot of those Ontario birds. Thank you, John English. If you guys have heard the saying "dead as a doornail," if people had X-rays earlier on, they might have said "dead as a bill nail." This is a deadened nail. It's got the little bite at the end there, and just a heads up craftsmanship. The guy knows he's got 1 nail to keep that tight, and he's making the most of it. Something you'd never see otherwise. Gives you an idea that he's probably done this before, or he's built something out of wood. And other variations on hollow birds. This is a bird that was made with laminated construction. This guy wanted a really big bird, and he might not have access to big wood. So this is how he did it. It looks kind of funny, but that's how it is. I've talked about craftsmanship already. Anytime I look at a good John Blair Sr. decoy, you can't not think about a guy who was just absolutely dialed in. Some of these birds, you don't see the body seam, 140 plus years later, and I have a lot of respect for that, knowing that a body seam can show up in a day if you don't do it right. So good for John Blair. Other types of construction techniques, we got mortise and tenon fits. So mortise and tenon, I've got a Mark McNair bird here, and this is a carved, let's see, I always forget which one's the mortise and which one's the tenon, but you get to see kind of more complex fits of how wood can be put together. And again, you don't always get to take apart the joints. That one's pretty convenient, but that's what that might look like. In this case, it's 2 different types of wood, so it's pretty easy to see that contrast. While we're looking at materials, we got a copper wire for reference. Obviously, that shows up white. And then that base is a piece of, it's probably like ipe or some tropical hardwood, dense as can be, and so naturally it shows up that way. You don't see a lot of tropical hardwoods in decoys. It does show up because it would wash ashore, and these guys are on the coastline where some of these things are coming up in the sailing ships. So we do see it from time to time, but there's a reference point for it. There's an example. Then applying X-rays to, who made it, or did the same person make this decoy as that decoy? And sometimes we ask that question on some of the most important birds ever made. Here's one of the dove-tailed geese with its eponymous dovetail neck joint. So here's a look on the inside. It's got those cool little L-shaped nails, which is noteworthy because, again, I've only seen that in about a half dozen birds maybe at this point. You got a meticulously hand-scooped body. You can see how he's carefully working around that joint there. Distinct nails. Then this is one of the dove-tailed shorebirds, and there's been question is, did the same person make the geese as make the shorebirds? And I think you can strengthen I'm pretty comfortable making the case from the outside of the bird, but it wasn't enough for everyone apparently. You can strengthen the case when you look at the inside. Meticulously hand-scooped inside. This guy's absolutely going to town. He's leaving it a little bit thick there so that stick will have a little purchase and it won't just tip all around like some hollow birds. But you've got the same little L-shaped nails, and you've got the putty chasing those nail holes. So that's a good indicator that, and there's some more things that showed up. But yeah, good indicator that the same person made the shorebirds as made the geese. And that was a fun thing back when we were doing the O'Brien collection, where we got to have two of the same thing at the same time and make that comparison, put it all together. Captain Osgood geese. There's one up at the Shelburne Museum. Thankfully, they x-rayed a bunch of their stuff, so I had access to those images. I'll show those in yellow. And then there's only one Captain Osgood goose that's not in the museum collection, which is even better that they x-rayed it, so we had a reference point. We're talking about comparables. So in yellow, you have the Shelburne Museum bird, which is super well documented. And then in gray and white, we have a bird that we brought to auction. And when you have effectively one of a kind, or the only one in private hands, it's good to have any comparables you can work off. And incredibly specific construction throughout the entire thing. Again, those special nails. You even have these little cheek patches. Like, he's adding pieces of wood that thick to get just the right bit out of the cheek, because apparently he had time and resources and just enjoyed the craft. Pretty insane. I've never seen anybody add that little wood to a decoy before in this context. But that was a valuable tool to be able to draw that comparison, and obviously a lot to look at in these birds. You actually have those little extra bits nailed on to give that teeny bit more width there at the base of the neck, and then really super special hardware for a detachable head, kind of like on the dove-tailed geese. And then sort of the funny views, or, well, that doesn't make sense, we need more information. Here's an Ira Hudson yellow legs or dowitcher, and looking at that, I could not have explained to you what those dots are, or not with confidence. So we shot it again, and when you look at it from another angle, pretty obvious. You got 4 nails. It's a laminated bird. Hudson was putting 3 pieces of wood together to make the bird. I appreciate him not making that a flatty. It's a better decoy because of it, and it can be perfectly well explained, but you need that second image. So one shot's not going to do it. Technically, you should have 3. I think you almost never need 3. 1 will usually get you there. 2 will follow up and answer a lot of questions. And all right. 3-piece shorebirds. Here's another one. We've got applied sides, so we're seeing these nails. Makes perfect sense. Beautiful construction. Speaking of original construction, you have original repairs. It kind of sounds like a contradiction, but a guy like George Boyd, apparently his wood supply was not great. His wood was probably come down and out of Maine. There's a lot of dry rot in the cedar that comes out of there. You see it in Wilson decoys all the time. But Boyd, despite his not phenomenal wood that he's starting with, he was a meticulous craftsman. So he would routinely go in and fill all these spots of dry rot. He would nail down lifted grain. So when you look at a Wilson decoy, they'll be lit up with very crude kind of craftsmanship that you can easily see from the outside. When you look at a Boyd, they'll all look like they're made out of a perfect piece of wood if they don't have a lot of wear. And then you look at an X-ray and you say, oh man, is this whole thing repainted? And then it turns out that the more Boyds you see, you just know that he did a lot of work to the wood before he put the original paint on. So this is something of a false positive. You got to look at a lot of them to have an understanding of that. But that's a pretty standard Boyd technique, and sometimes you'll get a little rust bleed coming through the paint and you're like, is there something down there? And yeah, there's something down there and it's supposed to be there, but you wouldn't generally expect it outside of the context of Boyd. Shot and paint. Here's a Ferdinand Bach canvasback that was once considered an excellent original paint. It was an excellent Bach paint, but not original paint. I got to be the messenger of that news, which is not a fun position, but comes with the territory. The reason we knew that it was repaint was it has shot buried in it. That shot has, you can see the tracer hole behind it is filled a little bit, and there are no shot holes showing in that bird. So you've got Bach takes phenomenal care of his phenomenal rig. He fills the holes, he repaints his bird. It's a perfect Bach decoy with perfect Bach paint. On a technicality, it's not original paint, but it's still one of the best Bachs you'll ever see. What do you make of that? Looking at bills. So a lot of times, bills are pretty much always black. Then you won't get white lead paint on bills. And in the case of Charles Sumner Bunn, he pretty much always seemed to paint his bills with that undercoat. And so this is a normal Bunn bill where you'll have that white lead going all the way down it. You'll see that paint flake all the time on the oak. It's got a pretty particular way of flaking. So this is a normal Bunn, super thick paint. You can see it's got these raised wingtips, and you're getting all sorts of overlapped wingtips and tail cuts going on there. So you really have to look at this bird from a few angles if you want to get a good read. But great Bunn craftsmanship. On the other side of the spectrum, here is a bird that has an original bill, and that was a dark piece of wood to begin with, and so it had absolutely no paint, black or otherwise, and it's a perfectly original bill. All these birds off in Nantucket have those same bills. They look like they're actually turned on a machine, and they're probably made out of walnut or something like that. But you've got great original white lead paint all over the bird. It looks like it could easily be a replaced bill, but it's perfectly original, and that's why you can't depend on the X-ray. You got to look at the bird. You got to look at comparables to make sense of it. And there's that dark hardwood. And then getting into some of the finer points of finding repairs, you can have an original object that that's been reset. In this case, you got a dust jacket Kroll plover. It has a lot of flaking, so you can see all that flaking in there. You could lose in that flaking this one line that works its way all the way through, but in fact it was a broken off bill and it was put back together. You can kind of see it when you look at the bill, and then you look at the X-ray and it helps support that. And so it's just a good way to look at it from every angle possible to know what you're looking at. But what's nice about that is you look at the base of the bill and everything about it matches up with the tip of the bill. So it is an original bill from end to end, but it was broken and reset. Good to know. Here is a wonderful professional repair or a partial replacement to a bill. From the outside, that'd be a really hard thing to spot for most people, take my word for it. And when you look at the X-ray, just cut and dry. You've got the head here, the bill insertion happens about here, and then obviously the restoration happens from here out. That's a layup. Then here's a little bit more complex one. Here's a bird that has a replaced bill. Now I've told you that bills can be all white, they can be all black, that can be okay. And then this one's got this teeny little nubbin coming out here, and that is a stub that's holding that replaced bill on. And so, yeah, it's a pretty good sense that this is going to be a replaced bill, and then it's easy to confirm when you get that extra little nub in there. So sometimes you got to look really closely, or you got to get the right exposure on the X-ray, because that's not always going to show up. And you also, with digital x-rays, you can play around with the settings. So you can change your, if you start with a good image, you can change the exposure if you're into that, and sometimes see a little bit more. All right, here's a bill repair. It's mostly replaced, but it's got a little original nub. So just different variations of pretty much anything you can imagine happening to a shorebird bill before and after its hunting history has happened, and x-rays will help unfold that. Here's an instance of, this is a bird that had a replaced bill, and it's not super clear which way it's going to go here. Except, and unfortunately it's happening right here on the edge of the image, there's a nail that's in the head, and that nail would have been going through the back of that bill material where it's splined back in the head. And that other part of the nail is missing, and so it confirms that, yes, in fact, this is a replaced bill, because there should be a continuation of that nail just above it. So this is a pretty nuanced one. That helps confirm what was probably suspected from the outside. That one doesn't show up so well. All right, this bird's not really showing up on this x-ray. And it doesn't tell us anything anyway, so we'll take a pass on that. That's a bird you got to hold in your hand and use other tools to try to evaluate. Here is a replaced bill, and it's got a fun little toupee replacement cap on the top of the head. Let's see. Let's put a few of these things together again. So looking at this Watson Brant, it's got all the nails are where I expect to see them in the body, and more importantly up here around the head. We've got putty over those nail holes. That looks good. There's no empty nail holes. That looks good. I don't know if you can quite see it. It does have a lower bill tip repair. It's got a tight little crack in the neck. Again, that's something that you can probably tell that from the x-ray. You're going to want to go back and forth. And it's got a hollow body, as you'd expect to see. So, pretty standard decoy that you can get a good overall read. We're going to learn a lot of things about this bird. Then, all right, here's something pretty tricky. Bill replacement that's designed to fool you from the outside, even when you take the bill out. So this bird had a removable bill, and on the inside of that joint was a nail with rust. So when you pull the bill out, you see that rusty nail spot, and that's fine. And then when you looked at this side, you'd also see that rusty nail spot that matches up in the bill. But you look at it in the x-ray, and clearly those things had a purely superficial match, and everything about them beyond that is does not match. So it helps confirm that it's a replaced bill, and it's somebody that was really kind of pulling out all the stops to make this not hold up for an x-ray, but hold up for a deeper than average visual inspection. That's not inherently a bad thing. It's one of those things that you want to know when you're transacting a decoy, however. We can x-ray just about everything. Minis are great. In the case of these Kroll minis, you can actually see Kroll's super fine plumage painting in there. So that's just fun to see. I like that. Kroll did a lot of white on white painting. So sometimes you'll have 3 layers of white on the same place. He's literally painting white feathers on a white base and different shades of white. Pretty wild. Fish decoys, super easy to x-ray. I mean, you guys can probably pick out that tail repair easily there. It's good to know, you can learn all sorts of things, just like bird decoys, but with a fish twist. I thought we'd shown it all with the taxidermy, with the paper mache. Here is the taxidermy decoy. That must be coming out of the Shelburne Museum. Then here's something that would generally be a false positive. I've seen people get tripped up on this, but fortunately there's a ton of masons, so we have a huge body of evidence to work from. In the mason factory, most of the time, I think the way they painted their birds was they would hold them by the bill while painting the rest of the body. And it would look like you've got a replaced bill tip because, oh, it's all great white lead paint, and then, oh, the end of my bill's gone. But you do mason after mason, and you'll see the same thing where the second half of the bill is going to have, sometimes you get easy brush strokes you can kind of follow and say, oh, it's naturally just not painted there. Sometimes it's a really sharp stroke and it looks like it's replaced. So good to know, if you're focusing on a maker, it's good to know what their techniques are, so that doesn't throw you and you think you got to replace bill when it's all original. Then you get some funny things like John Schweikert hollowed out his heads. I think I've only seen this in one other. So you can see a giant bullhead canvas back on a high neck is probably going to be extra tippy. And he went and did the extra step, hollowed out the head and bunged it. So I appreciate that about Schweikert. Some other little quirks. Here's a Stevens decoy. And he did a custom screw. So he took a screw and he hammered the edges of the screw, essentially made his own finish screw by tapering that head up, and that's a special Stevens move. I think that's pretty cool. Charles Birch, mortise and tenon. So Charles Birch obviously did a lot of mortise and tenon like we saw in that curlew there. You see this in certain regions would do, like Long Island, you'll see this on their bills. A lot of them are mortise and tenon. It's a more complex joint and takes a little extra work. And here you can see that nice flat front. Here's this is all one piece of wood from the bill through this. Essentially, he makes a dowel out of the back half of this bill wood, and then he's got the split where he slips the wedge into that. So just giving you a little more appreciation for the way Birch made his birds. Phenomenal craftsmanship. That was a Charles Birch goose, and here's a Charles Birch swan, and you've got a pretty similar take on the same thing. You can see he's treating that gap the same way. It looks like he probably sawed the gap out based on the way that doesn't, it's kind of a square gap rather than a pure wedge. So he probably sawed that, I'm going to guess. But great Birch comparables. Taking a tour along the Delmarva Peninsula, we've got Nathan Cobb, and Cobb liked to make hollow decoys. Phenomenal scooped out body. A lot of times Cobbs are going to have cut nails because that's when he was operating. Plenty of shot in there, salt water, so you'll get some rusty nails. What else are we seeing here? Here's another Cobb, same scooped out body. It's got a bottom board, essentially. It's so thin down there. He's even scooping into the bottom board a touch. Same type of nails, ton of putty coming up behind those nails. This is standard Cobb construction with that nail coming through. Inletted head with the caulk in the joint there. Here's another view of it. When you're handling these birds, you don't get a ton of them to look at, and anytime I can get an X-ray of some of these good old makers as reference points, even if I know the bird's perfect and don't have to make a case for it, I just want to know what it looks like so I have a reference again the next time. When it comes to Albert Lang, somebody that barely any of his birds are left, and I think Henry Stansberry challenged me on, is this bird a Lang? And he had me go back through all of my Lang X-rays, and it was a fun project to do, and it takes a while to build up a library where you can reference that. More Northampton County birds. Here's, unfortunately that's not showing up so well, but there's a good Northampton bird. You can see that mortise and tenon construction like you would expect. Great neck joint. So these are some of the things you'd expect to see. You don't usually expect to see a nail in the forehead, but you can find that little line there. It was probably original to the bird, or original to whenever it was painted last, because you can see the paint creeping into that seam. There is an indicator that there's probably a little paint in that seam. But that would be an old repair. Could have been original to the bird. Here's an Umbrella Watson. We looked at one before. Again, somebody you can really appreciate phenomenal construction on the inside and the outside. He's operating a little bit later with those wire nails. Beautiful hollowed out body. This one looks like it's in pretty good shape. Ira Hudson didn't really hollow out his bird, so you're going to see a solid body here. Very standard for Hudson. This is pretty standard Hudson nail construction, having those 2 nails come in the front, 1 in the back. Again, something where you look at a lot of them. They're not always going to be the same, but you'll notice these patterns and how makers preferred to do things. And even sometimes down to bits of hardware, you'll see that. Oh, and the fun thing about Cobb decoys and the Northampton County decoys, they were salvage guys and wreckers, and they're harvesting all of these boat materials that were coming ashore. And you'll see all sorts of mixed wood, original bunged holes, mixed hardware. You'll see hardware that's got copper in it, so it's old as can be, but there's no rust bleeds coming out of it like a piece of iron. So yeah, it's fun kind of reverse engineering a Cobb bird, because you get whatever might have come ashore in the last storm. Looking at Ira Hudson, here's a 2-piece Ira Hudson. Sometimes you'd take a block of wood and turn it, 45 degrees, and it's kind of that football style. You'll get those 2 sawmill marks. And other times, he was taking 2 blocks of wood, putting them together. So there's a 2-piece Hudson. He's doing it different ways depending on probably what the orders were or what the wood was that was available. So there's your single-piece body, and here's a 2-piece body, both Hudson. And we can see those parallels again between how he's putting the head on here and here. So a good kind of interior signature for the maker. Ward Brothers. I actually looked up the date on when corrugated fasteners came into being, because you really don't see them in decoys until the Ward Brothers. And they've been around pretty much as long as decoys. But the Ward Brothers brought corrugated fasteners to decoys in a way that no one has before or since. They probably bought them by the barge load, and you'll see them from the outside, and then you see a lot more from the inside. Corrugated fasteners, you can probably make out, well, I won't tell you what they are. Here's a couple angles. They're great for holding cracks together and keeping them from opening up. They will rust out, and that pressure of the wood will tear them apart sometimes. But when you look at wards, you're going to see a ton of these. This is a really standard giant nail coming down through the neck of an award. A lot of times you'll see that putty blow out at the top. Selective white lead we talked about before. And this is a little stabilizer nail down in the breast. I think there was some lifted grain. They didn't use a corrugated fastener on that one. They used a nail to stabilize that. Here's more corrugated fasteners. Here's one that's busted out here. Then you got a crack running along the back apparently, because they're lining that crack. Again, you can see that lead paint showing up differently, and that typical giant nail coming down through the head. Again, let's see, did we have No, I don't see any there. Big nail in the head. What's that?
Inletted tail?
Yeah, I think this one's got, that's going to have an inletted tail. And then, we all love Lemward's stippled white lead paint, and that's something that shows up really clearly here. So you get to see another take on it. More corrugated fasteners. It's hard to get away from them. Selective white lead paint, where you can make out that cheek or that eye patch on this teal. And you can also see, teal's bill is dark, and there was no lead paint down on that teal bill. Perfectly normal, all original. We just looked at a lot of x-rays that were shot by a phenomenal career x-ray technician, and he'll reshoot stuff until he gets it right, and he knows his machinery. This was a really wide bird, and it had a ton of paint on it. And so if it was standard settings, it did not have the image quality we're looking for, and this is telling us virtually nothing about the bird. It's just total whiteout conditions. So it's not the bird, it's the x-ray. You correct the x-ray, and we get all sorts of detail. Shot, paint, wear, wood. It can all be there. So if you're not getting the image that you want, or you don't feel like you're seeing what you should be seeing, work with the person shooting the x-ray until you get the settings right. Because you can do all the photoshopping you want to that, and you're not going to get any information out of it. And then this is telling pretty much the whole story. You are starting to lose the head, so maybe it's a bird. If you really need to know, you got to shoot it in 2 different settings to see it all. Image processing, I get all my images in the standard, white and black where the white is the thing absorbing the X-ray. There's a lot of ways to get distracted. People can show you X-rays in all different tiles. Here's a types. Here's a dual tone. This is like an infrared heat map. This is tinted. This is a great view. I really like this. I would probably, if it was easier, I'd probably do them all that way, but I'm so used to look at them the other way. If you got an option, I recommend this. It's a little, it's easier to read these generally, so that's generally the best way to do it. If you can, here's another take that's not helping us at all, and more. So yeah, I like black and white. That's really all you're going to need. Either one of those is going to do just fine. Back when we first started shooting them, when I first started shooting them 15 years ago, I'd take bins of birds down to the vet on Newbury Street in Boston, and it's always funny taking decoys to a vet, and you just have to have fun with it. And they were super expensive. They're still expensive, but they were particularly expensive on Newbury Street. And we'd jam in all the question marks into one image, and this was pretty standard fare. We'd learn what we needed, and we don't do it like this anymore, but you can pack stuff in there if you need to. What percentage of decoys can be X-rayed? Yeah, you can really do everything. As we've seen, acquiring X-rays. Veterinarians' offices are the best places. You want to call ahead, or think of somebody that's a friend. At this point, pretty much all X-rays are regulated, or you have to have a licensing to do it. That could be changing more. It's starting to change, but we're not there yet. If you're really lucky, if you got a friend that's a doctor, they might be into it. Obviously, I'm an auctioneer, and we provide X-rays. If you ask, don't ask me the day before the sale on something that's super low value, but just pretty much everything that's has a question mark or has a high value, we're going to have an X-ray, like McCleary said, at the time of the sale. Hopefully, well before the catalog is done. Dealers can help with getting X-rays. You want to use a specialist. Sometimes people will end up with X-ray machines, and they're pretty darn technical, so it's easy to not use them correctly. Safety. It's a super regulated industry, so that's good. Follow your specialist recommendations. The way that they shoot them now is far less radiation than it used to be. You get more radiation taking an airplane flight than you do, shooting these things all day. So yeah, you're perfectly safe. I think women of childbearing age aren't supposed to be in the room, but other than that, you can be around them all day. And my guy wears a Geiger counter, and he showed it to me, and it's effectively nothing. Selected literature. So yeah, I'm doing this on the shoulders of a lot of other people. I talked about Everett James, Bernie Crandall put a ton of X-rays in his book. Levinson and Headley did it back in '91. The Shelburne Museum's been doing a lot with it. So it's been done before. We're starting to see them in auction catalogs. There's a question about that where, here I am showing you guys these. We'll put these up online. Anytime I send out an X-ray, I try to put a disclaimer on that, it's not to be shared outside of the context of the conversation between the person representing the bird and the person thinking about buying it. And it's because it's so easy to misinterpret these things, especially when you don't have the bird in hand. And so it's important to have the context of somebody that's holding the bird and has studied it. So you don't want X-rays just flying around out there, but so there's sort of a balance where I don't generally publish. Mason's a super safe thing to send out there, but the Osgood is kind of half public anyway. But those dovetail birds, that's when we were looking at those, we're maybe the first people ever looking inside of those, and if somebody wanted to go out and make a dovetail goose and follow that template, it could really throw some people off. So you don't want to encourage people to use an X-ray as a template to make an old bird, or give them too many opportunities to do that. I love this McCleary quote, and that is it. So yeah, if anybody has any questions on this subject, happy to try to address them. And then before I forget, on Thursday this week, I've got some birds here. They're coming up in the auction. We were talking about the Waterfowl Festival. They have a benefit dinner at the Tidewater Inn on Thursday evening. I'll be over there, and I'm going to set up some birds beforehand to preview. So I've got some other stuff coming up in the auction if anybody can make it over there. The Waterfowl Festival's doing a cool showcase of some of their conservation efforts. And I think that's the only other thing I wanted to announce. So yeah, any questions? Must have covered it. Great.